Isn't it strange how a guard's coat can vanish on the coldest morning right when the radio hiss sounds like an old camp memory calling back? They scoffed at him, said he just misplaced it, never noticing how a man who once survived cold nights learns to hide his hurt in quiet corners. But the truth flickered when a folded note slipped from the collar as the hallway heater clicked, catching the pale dawn light the way a promise used to. Still, some coats return carrying more than warmth, they carry someone's dignity home. The wind came in sharp that morning, the kind that scraped across the parking lot long before the sun had a chance to soften anything. Ray pulled the collar of his jacket up as he stepped through the front doors of the Frostline Community Center, boots echoing briefly in the quiet entryway. He slowed when he passed the small library case near the lobby wall, 3 shelves of local history, yellowed photographs of the town's older veterans, and a folded flag resting behind glass. He nodded at it out of habit before pushing through to the side hallway. Frank was outside the auxiliary door, shoulders hunched, hands tucked against his chest. His breath rose in little white bursts. What stopped Ray wasn't the cold, it was the thin shirt the man was wearing. "Morning, Frank," Ray said. "Where's your coat?" Frank gave a tired smile, the kind worn by people who've worked too many night shifts and slept too little. "If I knew I'd be wearing it." Ray frowned. "You didn't leave it at home?" "No, I hung it in locker 17 like always." Frank rubbed his hands together. "Checked it twice before you walked in." The cold bit at Ray's ears as he reached for the auxiliary door. "Come on, let's take another look." Inside the hall, lights hummed faintly. The radiators along the wall weren't fully awake yet, releasing only a thin line of lukewarm air. Ray headed toward the row of metal lockers and twisted the latch on number 17. The door swung open with a brittle creak. Empty. Just the hollow smell of old metal and a single Red Cross winter advisory flyer sticking out from the corner where Frank had tucked it the night before. Frank touched the inside of the locker as if expecting the coat to return under his fingertips. "It was right here," he muttered. Ray crouched and checked the floor. No fallen fabric, no sign of anything bunched or caught. "You're sure nobody borrowed it? Maintenance security rotation?" Frank shook his head. "Nobody asks to borrow a coat. Not here." Footsteps approached, quick and clipped. Marcia, the daytime shift manager, rounded the corner with a clipboard pressed to her chest. Her expression didn't shift at all when she saw Frank shivering. "What's going on?" she asked. "His coat's missing," Ray replied. "Was in his locker last night." Marcia made a face somewhere between disinterest and mild annoyance. "Well, it's not our responsibility to track personal items. We can't babysit everyone's belongings." Frank's jaw tensed slightly, but he didn't speak. The comment slipped between them cold as the draft sliding under the door. Ray stared at the empty locker a moment longer. Something about the way the lock dangled slightly twisted to one side bothered him. Not broken, not forced open, just off, like it had been handled with unnecessary caution. He reached up and touched the latch, metal cold against his thumb. "We'll find it," Ray said quietly. Frank exhaled a small cloud of white drifting from his lips even indoors. "Hope so. It's colder tonight than yesterday." Ray didn't answer right away. He took another long look at the locker, then at the hallway stretching toward the staff lounge. Somewhere between the hum of the overhead lights and the hollow echo of the empty metal box, something didn't line up. "Something's wrong with that locker," he finally said. And the wind outside kept scraping at the walls as if agreeing. Ray leaned over the old security desk, tapping the monitor until the washed-out grayscale image stabilized. The camera feed sputtered like it was tired, the picture wobbling every few seconds. He rewound the footage to just before dawn, when the hallway was empty except for the flicker of the motion sensor light. There, Ray whispered. A figure came into view, just a faint outline moving slowly down the hall. The shape paused at locker 17, opened it with what looked like careful fingers, and then simply stood still for a moment before closing it again. No grabbing, no stuffing anything inside a bag, no hesitation that would hint at theft, just opening, lingering, closing, and then walking away. Frank watched from behind Ray, rubbing his arms to keep warm. "Can you zoom in on that?" "This camera's older than the coffee machine," Ray said. "Zooming is a suggestion, not a feature." He tried anyway. The image blurred into gray shapes without texture. Whoever the figure was, they blended into the shadows like they wanted to remain unremarkable. Ray hit play again. The door swung shut. The figure stepped out of frame, no coat in hand. So the coat wasn't stolen, Ray said quietly. It was moved where Frank asked. Ray didn't answer. He leaned back thinking. The camera should have caught the path out of the hallway, but the next feed in the sequence had been dead for months. The wiring needed replacing, and that repair had been pushed down the maintenance list over and over. He stood motioning for Frank to follow him into the main corridor. The morning staff had started to arrive, the building slowly filling with voices, and the soft clatter of key rings and carts being rolled out. The hallway smelled faintly of floor cleaner and old paint, ordinary familiar scents that made the missing coat feel even more unusual. Ray walked past the USO canteen setup near the lounge where a volunteer was setting out cups and coffee. The warmth drifting from the urns felt like a small mercy compared to the coolness seeping from the floor vents. Marcia appeared again, clipboard tucked under one arm. She didn't slow her steps. Find anything? Ray kept his tone even. Camera shows someone opening the locker. Didn't look like they took anything. Then Frank probably misplaced it. She offered a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. People misplace things more than you think. Frank looked down at his hands. Ray caught the momentary slump in the man's shoulders, the kind that didn't belong to someone who misplaced things. He hesitated, unsure whether to respond, but Marcia was already walking away. A heater on the wall buzzed, rattling like loose metal inside a tin can. Ray placed his hand near the vent. Barely a whisper of warmth came out. "This thing's losing the fight," he murmured. "Great," Frank sighed. "And I'm on tonight again." Ray folded the advisory slip in his pocket, feeling the brittle paper under his thumb. He kept seeing that blurry figure in the hallway, no rush, no panic, no obvious intent to steal. It was deliberate, but not malicious, almost like they were trying to keep something from happening. He looked down the long corridor past the empty chairs and the quiet vending machine, past the shadows pooling near the rec room doorway. Something about the whole thing bothered him more now than when the coat had seemed simply lost. Why would someone open a man's locker, move his coat, and then vanish down a dead camera zone? Ray breathed out slowly. "Why hide a man's only coat?" he murmured. And the question settled heavily in the cold air, as if the building itself didn't want to answer. The lost and found room always felt colder than the rest of the building, as if the vents never bothered to push warm air into it. Ray flicked on the overhead light, which hummed once before settling into a soft, steady glow. Rows of plastic bins lined the wall scarves, people forgot in December, mismatched gloves, a child's lunchbox with faded cartoon stickers. Ordinary things waiting to be reclaimed. He scanned the shelves slowly. "Frank, you said you checked in here already." "I did," Frank replied from the doorway. "Didn't see it." Ray crouched near the bottom row, shifting a stack of boxes aside. A scrap of dark fabric caught his eye, just a corner of material barely visible behind a crate of umbrellas. He reached in, pulled gently, and a familiar heavy coat slid free, the fabric folding into his hands with the unmistakable weight of something worn every day. "Here it is," he said. Frank stepped closer, relief flashing across his face before confusion took its place. "How'd it get all the way back there?" Ray inspected the spot where the coat had been wedged. "It wasn't dropped," he said. "It was placed, pushed in deliberately." He lifted the collar to check for damage and paused. A small square of paper was pinned to the inside lining. The handwriting was rough, as if written quickly with cold fingers. "Not safe for him tonight." Ray read it twice. Frank took a step back. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Ray said quietly. "But someone didn't hide this for fun." Through the thin wall behind them came the faint sound of voices, soft layered harmonies rising and falling. The community choir was practicing in the multi-purpose room, running through a gentle chapel hymn that floated into the lost and found like warm breath. It softened the room somehow, made the stacks of abandoned winter clothes feel less forgotten. But the note in Ray's hand didn't feel warm at all. He turned the coat over, brushing off dust, then looked at the K-Fiatrin. A sticky note was attached to the edge, bright yellow against the dull wood. Lost items cleared weekly per protocol. Ray tapped it lightly with his knuckle. This room gets cleaned out on Fridays. Yeah, Frank said. So if someone hid my coat back there, they meant for you not to find it. Ray finished. At least not last night. Frank folded his arms, frustration mixing with embarrassment. If someone had a problem with me, they could have just said it, not whatever this is. Ray didn't respond right away. He knew Frank wasn't the kind of man who liked to draw attention, especially negative attention, and he could sense the sting of being treated like someone who wouldn't notice his own coat missing. A small wound to dignity, quiet but sharp. Ray held the coat a moment longer, letting his fingers trace the worn fabric. Whoever hid it hadn't acted out of spite. The gesture was too careful, too measured, and that note. Someone believed they were protecting Frank. He handed the coat back gently. This isn't about you doing anything wrong. Then what is it about? Frank asked. Ray looked at the dark hallway beyond the doorway. The coat had been hidden for a reason that didn't match any simple misunderstanding. If it wasn't safe for you, Ray said slowly, then who was it really unsafe for? The question hung in the stillness, heavier than the coat in his hands. By the time the sun slipped behind the ridge, the wind had taken on a sharper edge, whistling through the gaps along the building's siding. Ray stood inside the south entrance near the small V-mail counter, a relic the center still used for holiday letter drives and veteran events. A stack of blank postcards sat neatly in a tray. His fingers tapped the counter while he waited. Frank's shift started in 3 minutes. Outside the parking lot, lights blinked on one by one. Their glow barely reached the curb where a young figure struggled with a heavy trash bin. It was Eli, the intern, who helped evenings when school let out early. He braced himself, leaning his whole body weight into the bin as the wind pushed back. Ray stepped toward the door. "Eli, hold up, I got it," the kid shouted through chattering teeth. "Just needs a little muscle." "You're freezing," Ray said. "I'm fine." He wasn't. Even through the glass, Ray could see the way Eli's fingers stiffened around the plastic handles. The kid didn't have gloves, and his hoodie wasn't close to warm enough for the dropping temperature. Frank appeared at Ray's side, then pulling the auxiliary door open with effort. His shirt collar whipped against his neck. "Evening," he said, forcing a smile. "That's your coat," Ray replied, nodding toward the garment folded over his own arm. Before Frank could answer, Eli managed to get the bin to the corner and bent over, trying to catch his breath. Ray looked from Eli to Frank, then back to the coat. The note from earlier echoed in his mind. Not safe for him tonight. He inhaled once. "Frank," he said quietly, "did you hide your own coat?" Frank's expression flickered. A small, guilty kind of pause. "Ray, let's not make a fuss." "I'm not," Ray said. "Just tell me." Frank rubbed the back of his neck. Kid wouldn't come inside. He didn't want Marcia thinking he needed help again. "Too proud, you know. He stood out here half an hour before his mom picked him up last night." He looked toward Eli, who still hadn't noticed them watching. "I figured if my coat disappeared, he'd go use the heater. Thought it might keep him warm long enough." Ray stared at him. "You hid it so he would stay warm." Frank shrugged, embarrassed. "Well, somebody had to make sure he didn't freeze." He chuckled softly, though the sound was thin. "Didn't think it'd turn into a whole mystery." A gust pushed through the doorway, lifting the corners of the advisory slip tucked in the coat pocket. The paper crackled sharply, as if reminding them of the cold waiting just beyond the threshold. Ray stepped forward and lifted the coat toward Frank. "Here," he said. "It's cold enough without you trying to be a hero in a thin shirt." Frank hesitated. "I didn't want anyone worrying." "Too late," Ray answered. "We already are." The older man finally slid his arms through the sleeves. He drew the coat close, jaw tightening for a brief second, just enough to show how much the cold had been biting at him all along. The wind pushed at the door again, rattling it like a warning. Behind them, someone from staff walked by and muttered, "If people followed the rules around here, we wouldn't have these problems." A small sting, needless dismissive, brushed past Frank as sharply as the air outside. Ray ignored the comment. Instead, he met Frank's eyes and nodded toward the dark lot where Eli worked quietly under the street lamp. "Someone has to watch out tonight," Ray said. And this time Frank didn't disagree. The next morning broke with a softer light, the kind that made the frost on the windows glow like thin sugar. Ray arrived early, half expecting the hallway to feel as tense as the night before, but instead he found a quiet hum of routine settling back into the building. He pushed open the door to the staff lounge. Inside, Eli was sitting at the table closest to the USO canteen setup, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. He looked up immediately. "Ray, I saw what happened last night." Ray pulled out a chair. "You did?" "Yeah. Through the side door window." Eli hesitated, then added, "Frank didn't know I was watching." Ray waited. "I saw him without his coat," Eli said. "And then I saw you hand it to him. I kind of figured out the rest." He looked down into his cup. "He hid it, so I'd go inside, didn't he?" Ray nodded once. "He didn't want you freezing." Eli swallowed hard. He shouldn't have done that for me." "That's how he is," Ray replied. "He looks out for people." Before Eli could respond, the lounge door swung open and 2 morning shift attendants entered, talking in low voices. One of them set a thermos on the guard desk, visible through the open doorway. "Who's that for?" Ray asked. Nobody said. The attendant replied. It just showed up with a note for the man on the cold shift. Eli and Ray exchanged a glance. A few minutes later, Marcia walked into the lounge, flipping through the day's schedules. She paused when she spotted Eli lingering nearby. "You doing all right, kid?" she asked, voice gentler than usual. "Yes, ma'am." Marcia looked toward the hallway, then back at Ray. "Make sure the guard heater's fixed before tonight. He shouldn't have to stand out there with that thing barely working." Ray blinked. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer to a correction than anything she'd said yesterday. As she turned to leave, Eli whispered, "People really do talk fast in this town." "They do," Ray said. "But sometimes that works in your favor." Word had moved quickly through staff passing each other in the hallway, through coffee break whispers, through the small-town instinct to quietly take care of their own. There was no ceremony, no announcement. Just little shifts, a warm drink left anonymously, a gentler tone from someone who'd sounded cold before, a sense of attention settling onto Frank without making a show of it. In a place like Frostline, compassion rarely arrived with fanfare. It tended to slip in sideways, disguised as routine, leaving warmth in its wake before anyone pointed it out. Ray leaned against the counter, thinking of Frank standing watch in his coat, finally warm again. He pictured the advisory slip in the pocket, the one that had whispered danger all night. He pictured Eli, too, trying not to show how much last night had shaken him. "You think Frank knows everyone's talking about him today?" Eli asked. "I think he'll pretend he doesn't," Ray said. "But he'll feel it." Eli nodded quietly. Ray looked toward the door past the empty chairs lining the hall. The coat mystery had unraveled, but something still tugged at him, some loose thread he hadn't tied up yet. "But someone had one more thing to fix," he murmured. And in the calm of the morning, the weight of that thought settled where the night's cold had faded. The heater groaned like an old man clearing his throat, one long metallic sigh, then a clunk, then silence. Ray tightened another screw and leaned back on his heels. The maintenance alcove behind the lobby had never been warm, but tonight the chill pressed in with more insistence than usual. Above him, a faded PX window. Donate Winter Gear poster fluttered where the air leaked through the frame. "Come on," Ray muttered. "You've worked colder nights than this." He adjusted a wire, tapped the casing, and the heater rattled awake with a low hum. It wasn't perfect, but it was stronger than the wheeze it had been giving Frank all week. Outside the alcove, the lobby doors shuddered each time the wind pushed against them. Ray wiped his hands on a cloth and stepped out. Frank was at his post near the south entrance, coat zipped to the chin. The same coat that had traveled through a locker, a camera blind spot, and a lost-and-found shelf before making its way back to him. His breath drifted in small clouds, steady and even, the way you breathe when the cold isn't winning anymore. "You get it working?" Frank asked. "Well enough," Ray said. "Won't win any awards, but it won't quit on you tonight." Frank nodded. "Good. Feels colder every hour." "It is," Ray answered. "But at least you're dressed for it this time." Frank let out a quiet laugh. "Thanks to you." "No," Ray said. "Thanks to whoever wrote that note." Frank looked away for a moment, and Ray could tell the gratitude sat somewhere deep quiet, like Frank himself. From the corridor, footsteps hurried toward them. Eli appeared, cheeks flushed pink from the wind he'd pushed through on his way back from the storage room. He held a stack of freshly printed flyers against his chest. "Look," Eli said, lifting one. "Finally convinced them to post these." Ray took the top flyer. The bold print read, If you're cold tonight, let someone know. We'll figure it out together." Ray nodded with approval. "Good message. Should have been up weeks ago," Eli said. "Some folks don't ask for help even when they need it." Frank gave him a knowing look. "Takes one to know one." Eli grinned sheepishly. "Maybe." Ray reached for a roll of tape on the counter and carried the flyer to the lobby wall. He smoothed it flat, letting the corners adhere to the cold painted surface. Behind him, he flipped on the small tabletop radio that sat near the welcome desk. The familiar warm voice of the local announcer filled the air soft static under a rhythm of fiddle and low guitar. Ray spoke toward the mic-shaped grill as if addressing someone only a few feet away. "Cold doesn't win as fast when somebody's watching out for you." Frank didn't say anything, but he adjusted his coat, settling the collar more comfortably around his neck. The coat looked heavier tonight, not just from wool, but from meaning. A staff member walking by glanced at the flyer Ray had posted and muttered, "About time we put something helpful up." A small jab, unnecessary but passing, floated in the cold air. Frank pretended not to hear it. Ray turned his attention back to the entryway. The glass doors reflected a faint image: Frank standing tall in his reclaimed coat, Eli gathering up the extra flyers, and Ray himself leaning beside the radio, listening to the hum beneath the winter wind. For a brief moment, everything held still, as if the building paused to acknowledge the shift that had taken place over the past 2 days. Ray let his gaze rest on the coat one last time. The fabric rippled slightly in the draft, carrying the quiet weight of what it had meant to each person who touched it. Some coats carry more than warmth. The wind outside the community center kept brushing against the doors, but inside the heater, Ray fixed carried a steady hum, warming the small corner where Frank now stood in his reclaimed coat. Folks walked past the radio on the desk without thinking much of it, yet its soft static felt like a reminder that someone had been looking out for someone else long before the story made its way around town. In places like Frostline, kindness didn't announce itself. It traveled the way a V-mail envelope once did, quiet, steady, and meant for one pair of hands at a time. And the truth lingered in the room long after closing. Every small mercy leaves a warmer trail than we think. Some coats carry more than warmth.